Any show that's a cultural institution like Doctor Who is going to attract more scrutiny than most, and is going to be held to a higher standard than most. As a family show watched by millions of young'uns around the world, there's only so much shock horror it can get away with. It's also witnessed so much cultural change over the decades, and certain things that might have been more acceptable at the time have since been rightly pointed out by critics and viewers. The result of all this? There are many episodes in the show's history that have been censored, re-edited, or even outright banned. I'm Ellie for Who Culture, here with 10 Doctor Who episodes that were banned or censored. Number 10. The Empty Child. Doctor Who's 2005 revival was a steep learning curve for everyone, from the rushed and chaotic production to the level of scares and horror the show could get away with in the 21st century. Both The Unquiet Dead and Dalek have been deemed scary and violent enough to earn a 12 rating from the BBFC, and a small degree of pearl-clutching in the tabloid press. In those cases, the Doctor Who production team stuck to its guns and chose not to remove the offending material, preserving the episodes as broadcast. It was a different case for Stephen Moffat's The Empty Child, however, which was deemed slightly too horrific for Saturday tea time. Specifically, the scene where Richard Wilson's Dr. Constantine transforms into a gas mask zombie was toned down in the lead up to broadcast. Hang on, you're telling me it was even scarier at one point? I'm still traumatized. Originally, the visuals of the unsettling transformation were accompanied by bone-cracking sound effects, but these were swiftly given the boot. Phew. Thank God for that. At the time, producer Phil Collinson said the sound was, quote, too visceral, and so they removed it at the BBC's request. Though interestingly, Stephen Moffat suggested on a DVD commentary that the sound effect was never supposed to be used in the first place. Well, whatever the case, the scene is chilling enough as it is, thank you very much. Number 9. The Keys of Marinus. Perhaps the earliest example of Doctor Who being censored comes from the 1964 serial The Keys of Marinus. Interviewed for episode 11 of Toby Hadoke's Who's Round, actor Peter Stenson revealed that he caused a bit of a commotion after an on-set mishap, which prompted him to let out a, quote, very rude word. Stenson tripped over, which was inevitable given that he played both a Vord and an eye soldier, neither of which were designed with an actor's sightlines in mind, and let out a big ol' swear word. In those early days of Doctor Who, time and budgetary restraints meant that retakes were at a premium. Where possible, directors would just move on and keep shooting. This is why most of William Hartnell's Billy Fluffs are kept in the final edits of First Doctor episodes. But Stenson's rude word was simply unable to be broadcast in the 1960s, especially between Grandstand and Jukebox Jury. To fix the issue, the offending audio track was removed so as not to scandalise the nation's children. Stenson said that this minor incident meant that he wasn't asked back to the BBC for 20 years, which sounds like a pretty harsh punishment. Just how rude a word could it possibly have been? Number 8. The Curse of Clyde Langer. When the Sarah Jane Adventures was added to BBC iPlayer in late 2022, it was missing The Curse of Clyde Langer Parts 1 and 2. But why? The story was a high point for the series and even won the Best Children's TV Script Award from the Writers Guild of Great Britain. In his Letter from the Showrunner column in Doctor Who magazine issue 588, Russell T Davies revealed that initially even he didn't know the reason for its absence. It soon transpired that The Curse of Clyde Langer had been marked Do Not Use due to a historic complaint against the episodes. If you remember, the story involves Clyde being cursed by the alien Hetekumtek, who is masquerading as a Native American god. In the original episode, Clyde touches a totem pole said to have originated from the Mojave Desert, which transfers the curse that leaves him ostracized by his friends and family. Except the Mojave didn't make totem poles like those depicted in the episode. To fix this glaring cultural inaccuracy, Russell T Davies enlisted The Curse of Clyde Langer's original editor, who is now working as a post-production producer on Doctor Who, to remove the offending material. And she did all this work in her spare time, free of charge, and the story was soon returned to iPlayer. Number 7. The Talons of Weng-Chiang. When an omnibus edition of the Talons of Weng-Chiang was submitted to the BBFC for classification in 1988, it fell foul of the moral panic surrounding martial arts weaponry. The British Board of Film Classification had strict rules about the depiction of such weaponry, and requested that an early scene where the Doctor and Leela are menaced by a nunchaku-wielding henchman be cut. However, this wasn't the only time that Talons fell foul of censorship in the 1980s. Syndication screenings in both Ontario and Los Angeles banned the the story due to complaints from the local Chinese community and objections from a local sponsor. In Ontario, a focus group of Chinese viewers gave feedback on the serial and singled out its, quote, racist stereotyping of people of Chinese origin. This led to further complaints from the Chinese Canadian National Council, who highlighted the story taking inspiration from Chinese supervillain Fu Manchu as a major problem. What's interesting about this is that it feels like one of the only times somebody thought to actually speak to Chinese audiences about their views on the Talons of Weng-Chiang. The episodes were duly pulled from broadcast in Ontario, Los Angeles, and elsewhere in Canada and the USA. Number 6, the TV movie. Perhaps because American censors are a bit more forgiving when it comes to horror and violence on primetime TV, the 1996 TV movie found itself staring down the barrel of a 15 certificate in the UK. To compensate, the BBFC suggested various cuts that would bring the certificate down to a more family-friendly 12 rating. For example, the censors felt that the chaotic operating theatre scene was way too much. As a result, a section involving the probe becoming stuck in the Doctor's body was cut, as was Sylvester McCoy's final scream before dying on the operating table. The most contentious material involved the gun violence that ultimately claimed the 7th Doctor's life. Shots of Chang Lee's friends being gunned down were cut, as were scenes of the gangsters threatening Lee prior to the TARDIS materializing. These decisions surrounding the gun violence were largely made due to the horrific school shooting in Dunblane, Scotland a few months prior to transmission. Chang Lee's brutal death was also cut, with the shot of the Master snapping his neck removed. Much of this material has since been restored, however, and the story is viewable in its full, unedited form. Number 5. Classic Who censor clips. During the 1960s and 1970s, episodes of Doctor Who were sent out to various countries for broadcast on their national networks. Australia and New Zealand were two of the countries in receipt of Hartnell and Troughton serials, but they were much stricter about what was deemed acceptable for broadcast. It was standard practice for Australian and New Zealand censors to remove scenes or sequences that were deemed too offensive, violent, or graphic. Sequences like the gassing of Maggie Harris in Fury from the Deep ended up on the cutting room floor, as did the brutal bit of knife throwing in The Smugglers. Bizarrely, and on the plus side, these offcuts are now some of the only bits of footage that remain from these missing serials. While these censor clips are one of the only ways we can get a sense of Fury from the Deep or The Smugglers, the Time Meddler had the opposite thing happen. When the serial was fully recovered from Nigeria in the mid-1980s, it was discovered that a 12-second scene where the Vikings Ulf and Sven are killed was missing, due to it being deemed unsuitable for broadcast. For completionists, these missing seconds were restaged and filmed for inclusion in the remastered version of The Time Meddler, released in the Doctor Who Season 2 collection box set. All's well that ends well. Number 4. Robot of Sherwood. Sometimes real-world horrors can impact the fictional world of Doctor Who in strange ways. In 2014, Islamic State beheaded journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff in response to US airstrikes on Iraq. These horrific acts were millions of miles away from Sherwood Forest, but they still impacted Mark Gatiss' breezy Robin Hood adventure. In Robot of Sherwood, the 12th Doctor and Clara discover alien robots involved in the myths and legends of Robin Hood. As originally written and recorded, the Sheriff of Nottingham was beheaded during a sword fight, which would have revealed that he too was a robot. This was written and filmed many months before the deaths of Foley and Sotloff, but Robot of Sherwood's air date made it impossible not to draw uncomfortable comparisons. The episode aired on the 6th of September, 4 days after Sotloff had been beheaded. Out of respect for the victims and their families, the decision was rightly made to cut the Sheriff of Nottingham's beheading scene. Fortunately, this didn't have too great an impact on the episode, though it did make the Sheriff's claim that he was, quote, half man, half engine more confusing than it would otherwise have been. Number 3. Mission to the Unknown. We've already seen how Australian censors cut contentious material from 1960s episodes of Doctor Who, but Mission to the Unknown is worthy of its own entry. This prologue to the 12-part epic The Daleks Master Plan was offered to Australia's ABC network in 1966 as part of a group of serials that included The Mythmakers and Galaxy 4. But when Australian censors sat down to watch the episode, they were disturbed by its content. Mission to the Unknown is certainly bleak, as none of the new hero characters make it out alive, And as well as the Daleks, it also features the creepy Varga plants, which infect their victims and turn them into homicidal maniacs. All of this was clearly too much for the Australian censors, who reportedly banned the episode from being broadcast. To this day, the original too horrific for Australian TV Mission to the Unknown remains completely missing, but fortunately it was lovingly restored by the University of Central Lancashire in 2019. And don't worry, Australian censors, everyone involved seems to have been over the age of 18. Number 2, the pyramid at the end of the world. We may think we're living through divided and difficult times right now, but the geopolitical situation during Peter Capaldi's Doctor Who era was just as tumultuous. We've already seen how the murders of 2 US journalists necessitated some changes in Robot of Sherwood, for example. A few years later, small cuts were made to the pyramid at the end of the world, the second entry in Series 10's Monk trilogy, out of respect for the victims of a horrific tragedy that occurred just days earlier. In the finished episode, the monks offer humanity protection from an impending catastrophe. Is it a new strain of bacteria? A pandemic? Well, apparently, the original version of the episode included a reference to terrorism, which the Doctor quickly dismissed as one of the candidates for this incoming world-ending event. Then, on the Monday before the episode went out, a suicide bomber attacked the Manchester Arena during an Ariana Grande concert, killing 22 people and injuring over 1,000 others. In light of this incident, this brief reference to terrorism was trimmed from the pyramid at the end of the world out of respect for the victims of the attack. The result is unnoticeable, and the scene flows perfectly well despite the cut.
What else could end the world?
Bacteria.
I like the sound of that.
Number 1, The Deadly Assassin. The ending of The Deadly Assassin Part 3 is an iconic moment in Doctor Who history, not least because of all the fuss that surrounded it. As originally broadcast on the 13th of November 1976, the episode included a freeze-frame cliffhanger with the Doctor's head being held underwater by Goth. Along with all the other dark and violent content in the story, this watery conclusion attracted the ire of activist Mary Whitehouse, who successfully cajoled the BBC into editing the master tape of Episode 3 and deleting the cliffhanger altogether. Whitehouse allegedly quoted a young boy who had said that he would similarly hold his brother's head underwater the next time they got in an argument. With the BBC no longer possessing a complete unedited version of the original broadcast, the image of the Doctor drowning was restored using off-air home video recordings. So curiously, the Whitehouse cut is the version that currently exists on iPlayer. It's difficult to see what all the fuss was about today, though you can imagine that in the more quaint TV landscape of the 1970s, leaving children for a whole week on the image of the Doctor essentially being waterboarded would court some controversy. All I can say is thank God Mary Whitehouse wasn't around to see Torchwood. Can you imagine? And that concludes our list. But for some more contentious episodes, why not check out the 10 most divisive Doctor Who episodes? In the meantime, I've been Ellie for Who Culture, and in the words of Riversong herself, goodbye, sweeties.